Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'm card making with printed papers and die cuts using the new Just Sayin collection from Spellbinders. It has a pieced heart die, which is nice and large, a punctuation icons die, as a bold floral embossing folder, and 6-inch printed papers, perfect for card making. There's also some coordinated Just Sayin cardstock die cuts that are in the same bold, bright colors as well. There's a lot of die cuts in this package. I'll be using a few of each one of them, or at least one of them on each one of the cards. The back of the package shows exactly what die cuts are in there, and they also have duplicates of each one. So you can use each one on multiple cards or duplicate them on a single card if you want. For my first card, I'm using the pieced heart die, and I have the shadow part of the die cut out of some Onyx cardstock, and then the pieced heart piece die cut out of white cardstock. I just laid that shadow part on top of a 5x5 card background just to give you an idea of how big that is. It doesn't even fit in the width of the 5-inch background, so, or the 5-inch card base. So it's really great for large projects. I thought it would be nice to have different sections of this pieced heart embossed with different embossing folders. So I have 5 different embossing folders here, and I'm putting either 1 or 2 pieces in each one. I have the bark embossing folder, Plaster, Peacock Motif, Flower Frenzy, and beautiful butterflies, but any embossing folder would work. You could even use the one that's part of this collection. I chose not to because I wanted to use 3D embossing folders, and that bold floral is a 2D embossing folder or a regular embossing folder, so it doesn't have quite as much dimension. I put the pieces of cardstock in that embossing folder and just set them all to the side. If you want a certain area of that embossing folder in that piece, obviously you would put your piece right in that area. Otherwise, you just put it wherever you want them. So all 5 of these embossing folders are 3D embossing folders. I chose 5 different ones. You could easily do, say, just 2 and alternate them if you wanted, or I think there's 7 pieces total, or 6. I think it's 7 pieces total. You could do 7 different embossing folders if you want. I have a ton of them, so I just kind of picked ones that have a little bit of an all-over pattern. I didn't choose any that have geometrical patterns. I wanted it to be a little bit more random. So once all of those pieces are embossed, we can put them together, and I'm just laying them down on my cutting table on my glass mat before starting to glue them onto the shadow piece. Now, because these are all cut separately, I have to say they're a little bit challenging to put on the black shadow and get that shadow nice and even. So I am doing 2 cards with this black shadow. I found that this is actually not a great one to start with. This second one here is probably a better one to start with. But even with starting with that one, it was still quite challenging. Another option, and I thought about it afterwards, would be to use some press and seal and put your die cuts together on your surface. Use that press and seal to hold it together, and then glue it to your shadow, and you can control it just a little bit better. It's definitely going to be a little bit more difficult when these pieces are 3D embossed because of that texture, but it might be an easier way to get them placed properly and nice and evenly around, or with that shadow nice and even around the heart. Now, this particular one isn't quite as bad as my next one. My next one, you can really see that it's not even all the way around. I still like the final result, but like I said, it's definitely challenging to get that shadow even around, because it's really hard to judge how thick that shadow should be when all of those pieces are in separate bits. So once I have all of my little bits here glued down, I'm just going to let that glue set a little bit. I'm gluing everything with some Barely Art glue, and it gives you a little bit of wiggle room when you're putting pieces like this down, putting die cuts down. I always like having that wiggle room. Now, I like to have my glue in a fine tip bottle, and I regularly will get asked how I keep it from clogging. I have a fine pin on my desk just on top of a magnet, so it's always within reach. That makes it really easy to take any clogs out of it. if you have an issue with it, and I started to realize that I was really having an issue with it, the best thing, in my opinion, to do is to take that top off and completely rinse it out with some water. I was finding that I was getting a little bit of dried glue on the inside part of the bottle, and it was clogging from the inside part of the bottle. So even with that pin, piercing it in there and unclogging it, it would be a temporary solution. So if you're finding that you're having an issue regularly and it's not helping with that pin, then maybe try completely cleaning out your glue top so that there is no glue possibly in the inside of the bottle that has dried or gotten really hard or gotten harder and is clogging that little nozzle. With my base of my card done, I can start adding some of these die cuts. Now I picked out some floral die cuts. I really love working with florals, and it's fun for something, a little bit of a change, to use some pre-printed florals. So I picked a few different ones, and I'm going to layer them on top of each other just to fill in the left side or left bottom side of the heart. Then I also have a happy day sentiment that's from that same Just Sayin die cuts package. So I'm going to glue that on as well. Now, the one thing that I do find when I'm using pre-printed die cuts is they tend to be a little bit flat. So one of the things that I like to do is just add a little bit of Stickles. For this, in this instance, I'm adding them to some of the centers of the flowers or some of the tiny flowers. It just adds that little bit of extra texture. I know we have some texture with the embossing, but by adding that Stickles, it adds even more texture, and it also just adds that little bit of sparkle and takes it to the next level. I'm going to set that aside to dry while I work on the pieces for my next card. So I have them die cut the same way. I have my white pieces die cut from the pieced part or the upper layer of that pieced heart, and then my shadow part is die cut out of some Onyx Cardstock. Now for this one, I'm going to use some distress inks, and I'm going to ink blend on each one of these pieces because there are so many colors in this cardstock or in the printed papers as well as those die cuts. I'm going to ink blend them in different colors. So I have a variety of different distress colors here. I'm using picked raspberry, spun sugar, fossilized amber, crushed olive, cracked pistachio, uncharted mariner, and prize ribbon. I picked different ones that were similar in color to the colors from those printed papers or those die cuts. I'm using some Pink Fresh brushes. These are really nice and easy to hold in your hand, and they have nice soft bristles to them and a flat surface. And I find that they're really nice for getting light ink blends. I love my Spellbinders ones as well, my large ink blending brushes. I chose to use these ones for this project simply because I wanted to have all of my pieces on my mat, on my sticky mat, while I was creating, and the large blending brushes probably would have gotten color on some of the other pieces. So by having some smaller ones, it just gave me the ability to do my ink blending on all these different pieces without contaminating my ink onto a different piece or a different die cut. So I've already done that picked raspberry, the spun sugar, and the fossilized amber. This here is the crushed olive. You can obviously do these in any color you want. You can even do all of them in the same colors if you want. I just thought it would be a fun way to tie in with the different colors from the rest of the collection. So distress inks, if you haven't used them before, they are water reactive. So once I'm done my ink blending, I am going to put them on my desk, and I'm going to splash some water on them just to give them a little bit of visual texture, a little bit more interest. When I'm doing my ink blending, I'm trying to be darker around the outside and lighter towards the inside. I don't want flat ink blending because if I wanted just flat color, I could have easily just used colored cardstock instead. I wanted to have the look of the ink blending and have some color variation to them. So you can see too, when I'm doing my ink blending, I'm doing it really, really quickly. I'm not necessarily being a perfectionist with it. I'm not making sure that it's perfectly ink blended because I know that I'm going to splash the water on it, and it's going to add that color variation as well as the visual texture from that. So I'm putting my pieces together in the shape of a heart. I have my Mighty Mister here. I'm spraying that water in the palm of my left hand and using my right hand to kind of flick that water on there. After doing it with my hands, I'm going to take my Yasutomo brush and I'm going to put that in some water and get some lighter flicks to it or smaller flicks to it. With that brush, I can just get a little tiny splatter, and then there's a variation in the size of splatters, and I just like the look to it. You can leave that water on there to dry completely, or you can take a piece of paper towel and blot it off. You really have the control over that. The nice thing too is if you want more splatters, you can do that again. If you like it how it is, you can just let that completely dry. While that was drying, I thought it might be interesting to add a little bit more splatter to it. So I'm using the indigo color from the watercolor mixing set, and I'm going to add some splatters to it. Now this indigo, it does have a blue tone to it, but it's so dark it almost looks black, and I thought it would tie in well with the black shadow around it, as well as the different black accents that I'm using for the rest of the cards. So I used my Mighty Mister to spray the water on that color mixing set or the indigo set, and then used my Yasutomo brush and just flicked it on my hand just to get some nice thin splatters. For on top of these florals, or on top of this heart, I cut out some of the florals from the bold or the Punctuation icons die set, and I'm ink blending the centers of those florals with some of the distress colors that I used for ink blending the heart pieces. This is just going to tie all those colors in. I have pink sand cardstock, dahlia cardstock, persimmon, as well as saffron cardstock here. And the green that I used was a Hero Arts cardstock called Pesto. So after I'm done doing my ink blending, I'm going to use some glue and just put in those flower centers. I die cut them in the same colors as the flowers, but I'm just going to alternate which ones I put it on. I'm going to put a different color on each one of the flowers, but this way they're also going to all coordinate together or coordinate with each other. And then at that point, my indigo splatters were still not totally dry. Most of them were dry, but there was a few that were still fairly wet. So I added some stickles to the centers of the flowers as well, so that could dry at the same time. If I'm waiting for one thing to dry, I might as well wait for several things to dry. And I had to go out to do errands, so I might as well let this dry while I was not even going to be around in the house anyways. So once it is completely dry, we are ready to assemble the heart. So I'm going to do the same thing as I did before. This time after the first card, I've learned that doing this piece that I first did there is the best one to start with. So I kind of eyeballed and judged the center of the heart, as well as tried to evenly space the top to the bottom. But as you can see, as I go along, it definitely isn't completely even. So it's definitely not a foolproof plan. I thought it was when I started, but it's definitely not. So this is where, say, using some press and seal and putting the heart upside down so that the colors were against the press and seal, and then gluing them all at once, putting them all down at once, might be the best way to get it nice and even. And I wanted to address this while I'm putting this together, simply because with the contrast between the black and the colors, you can definitely see that it's not even all the way around. I don't think it's a make or break thing, but you can definitely see that the area around the right side of the heart is a lot narrower than the shadow around the left side of the heart. For this one, I'm going to do a 5x7 card. And because my printed papers are 6-inch, I chose to cut that down to 4x6 so that there was a proportional area around it for my card. And then my black mat there is cut to 4.5 by 6.5. I'm gluing the heart to those layers, and then I'm going to let that sit for a moment and use my shears to trim the excess of the heart off of the rest of that mat. I wanted my heart to go right to the edge of the black, but I didn't necessarily want it to go to the edge of the card. Once that is done, I can put that onto my card base, put my acrylic block on there, and use my floral die cuts on top of that just to make sure that the position or the placement that I have in my head is what I want, or how I want it to look. When I'm gluing my florals down, I just use my fingers to curve the petals. I like the way it gives it a little bit of dimension, and it, to me, is nicer than having just plain flat die cuts for this. And whenever you have the option to do that, I always like to. It's just a personal preference. I'm going to glue the florals down first, and then I'm going to tuck in the leaves where I want them to go after that. Between the florals and the leaves, I am going to put in my sentiment, and that way when I go and put my leaves, I can make sure that it's not in an area where my sentiment is, so I don't cover any of those letters. I love the fact that that floral is nice and bright, or the heart is nice and bright colored, and it coordinates beautifully with the colors from the hello sentiment. When I'm putting my leaves, I am curving them with my fingers as well. And like I said before, making sure that it doesn't cover the letters of the hello. And I typically will do 2 leaves per floral. However, I only cut 6 leaves and I have 4 florals or 4 flowers here. So it doesn't necessarily always work out. I typically will try to make sure that they're kind of dispersed all the way around the area. And it's just how I like to do it, or I create a look that I like. So here is that finished card, and I love the texture that you get between the distress ink, the water splatters, and the indigo splatters. For the next card, I'm going to use that bold floral embossing folder. I have a piece of watercolor cardstock here. When I started doing this, I had intended to watercolor my florals and then go and do the black on the embossing folder. As I was embossing it, I changed my mind and decided to just do ink blending on the florals and then the black on the embossing folder. So you don't necessarily need to use distress watercolor cardstock here or watercolor cardstock. A regular cardstock would work because I'm not using that liquid or that water on there. Sometimes when we're in the middle of a project, we just have a different idea or we just change things up. I kind of figured because I have all these distress pads out, that this just made more sense by using some ink blending tools, and I'm using some detailed ink blending tools so that I have the control over where each one of those colors goes. Then I'm going to tape this piece back into my embossing folder, and I'm going to put black ink on that embossing folder, so any of the background area is not going to be shown. So you can see as I'm doing my stenciling, it is going to be a hot mess. It is not going to be pretty in any way, shape, or form, but I already know what I plan on doing with it, so it doesn't need to be perfect. Another option here, if you didn't want to do black on the background, is to use those same detailed ink blending brushes. However, just be very, very careful with them and only put ink on the upper level or the highest point of that embossing. Definitely this way is a little bit easier with the brushes and with the inking. It's a little bit more forgiving because the black ink is darker than all of these colors. So it's going to cover any of that ink that went on the background. Like I said before, this is a 2D embossing folder, so the dimension of that embossing is really not that deep. So when you're doing this, even if you try to be very careful, it's really hard to only stay on the upper level of it. So that first color that I used there was the crushed olive, and I'm using all the same colors that I used for ink blending my heart pieces. I wanted this to coordinate with the colors from my last card as well as the colors from the die cuts. By using detailed ink blending brushes, I can have control when some of these areas are close to another area where I want a different color. The yellow that I used there was the fossilized amber, and then now I'm going in with the prize ribbon, and there's just some tiny florals in there that I'm using the prize ribbon for. These are kind of background florals. You can see how quickly inking this up is when you're not concerned about being a perfectionist, when you're not worried about how it's looking at this point. And like I said, it's definitely going to look like a hot mess before it gets any better. Once I have that prize ribbon done, I'm going to start doing the larger flowers in this background. These ones I'm going to do in the spun sugar and the picked raspberry. So I'm starting out with the spun sugar. I'm going to do a color base over the entire thing, and then I'm going to go in with the picked raspberry and just do some of the areas where I want to have a little bit of shading or a little bit of that darker color there. Obviously you don't necessarily need to do any shading here, but because these florals are quite big, there is the room to do that. So I thought I might as well have fun with it and add that little bit of shading there. And when I'm saying shading, I'm not being just like the rest of this, I'm not being completely detail oriented with the shading. I'm just adding a little bit of that darker color. So some of these flowers are a side profile, and I'm just starting at the base of the flower and kind of flicking that brush up to make it go so the base of the flower would be the darker color, or the petals behind the forward petals, shall we say. For the larger flower where you see the top view, I'm taking my brush and kind of going on the side to the edge of the petal and then flicking my way out. So I want to see both colors. I want to see that picked raspberry as well as the spun sugar. Then I have a few of those larger flowers that I ended up missing with that prize ribbon, so I go back in there. And then I'm doing some more of the crushed olive for the leaves and stuff like that I missed. Anytime I'm doing these or using blending brushes, if I'm going between different shades from the same color family, I will use a scrap piece of paper to clean off my brush so that I can get as pure of a color as possible. Obviously, sometimes I forget and get a little bit of contamination, but sometimes that creates different opportunities. So these last ones here, I'm using the cracked pistachio. These are just dots in the background. I'm not sure if they're supposed to be flowers or not, but there's kind of filler pieces. So I thought that cracked pistachio would be good for that. I also didn't want to bring in new colors. I wanted to stick with the colors that I'd already used. So I just did it in those colors there. Once I have my background done, I can put it right back in the folder. And the nice thing about having it embossed already is it makes it really easy to kind of put it in there, move it around, and it kind of locks in place once the pattern gets matched. I'm still using some Best Ever Craft tape to tape that in place to make sure that cardstock is not going to move. Then I'm using some Black Soot Distress ink, inking over top of the opposite side of the embossing folder and closing it, putting it through my die cutting machine. Now this step needs to be done. I typically will do it 3 or 4 times. However, I noticed that my Black Soot Distress pad was extremely dry and had very little ink in it. Now I could have gone and kept going and layered that ink on top of each other, and it eventually would have covered that back, but it would take it a lot more layers. So I figured I might as well ink my pad up. So I have a Distress re-inker that I just put over top of my pad. I also put a little bit around the edges of that felt pad. I do let it sit for a while. I want to say probably a good half an hour before I continue on. But you can see how much more ink I'm getting on that background there. Even with that, and knowing that I have re-inked my pad, I still have to do it a couple times. When you're using an embossing folder, it's plastic, and the dye ink really doesn't sit well on plastic, so it starts to kind of bubble up and repel that ink. So by doing several layers, I can fill in some of those areas that aren't quite covered. I did it 3 times, and then I noticed there was a top corner and a bottom corner that just weren't covering in a certain area. So when it comes to that, once that background is pretty much done, if there's just some spot areas, you can fill in those spots. Now, when you look at my background, it's not pristine. It's a little bit more grungy mixed media. I have a little bit of ink on top of those colored areas, or a little bit of black ink, sorry, on top of those colored areas. But it's a look that I kind of like. It looks a little bit different. So I'm going with it. If you want something more pristine, obviously, you're going to want to be very careful when you're inking your embossing folder. Now I'm using some Cosmic Sky for my mat here. I trimmed it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And then I trimmed my embossed piece down to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. So that blue frames it really, really nicely. You could also use any of the other colors from that background. Now, because that background is so bold, all I'm doing with this card is just adding a hello sentiment on there. I'm tried to choose an area where there were no florals, so I only put it over top of a leaf. I didn't want to cover any of those pink florals. And then for just a touch more texture, I'm adding some Stickles to some of the centers of the flowers. I'm only putting a dot in there, so it will need to sit and dry for a few moments. Probably about 10-15, depending on how big of a dot you're adding. But it just adds that little bit of extra sparkle to it. So it just gives it a little bit more texture. And there is the final result. Now you could even use that embossing folder and just leave it as is and not color those areas. But because the rest of this line was so bright and bold, I just thought it would be fun to have a bright and bold embossed background. For my last card, I have a few of those printed die cuts chosen. But I also thought it would be fun to use the brackets. Sorry, I lost the name. The kind of square brackets there. They kind of look like a big C. There's 2 different ones to choose from. There's a thinner one and a thicker one. They are intended that you could layer them on top of each other if you wanted, but I thought it would be kind of cool to use them as a background. Now, full disclosure, this is not a card that I would make often. This is one, it's a labor of love. It takes a while to die cut all those pieces, and then it takes a while to lay it down. This would be a cool one if there was a stamp that had that pattern, because I really love the final look of it. But again, it's definitely not one that I would do multiples of, because it takes a long time, not only to die cut, but to put each one of these die cuts down. But like I said, it creates a cool pattern. So I used my ruler and pencil just to mark the center horizontally and vertically. I wanted to make sure that I started in the center so that when I had my pattern finished at the end and trimmed everything off, it was centered and I didn't have kind of a pattern that was off to the side. I'm starting with the thick brackets, or thick C's, if you will, and I am putting them just inside or just outside of my pencil lines. I wanted to also take those pencil lines out. So as I'm going, I am erasing those pencil lines. I'm doing it when the glue is wet so that I can really get that eraser in there, but I can easily see where it's supposed to go so I can place it correctly when I place it back. Then I'm going in and doing several offset with the thinner of those brackets. So I put one in the center, then I take another one, I cut it in half, and I'm going to glue it on either side. So I kind of thought this would look a little bit kind of like a woven background, if you will. Like obviously not totally, but it just kind of has a little bit of that vibe once it's completely done. Now those thin brackets, the two on the sides, they don't go all the way to the sides, and I'm aware of that. But this piece here, this cardstock that I'm gluing this to, is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. I already know that I'm going to cut 1/4 inch off of each edge in order to accommodate for a mat behind it. So I'm not worried about if my die cuts go all the way out to the edge. My main concern is trying to keep them nice and even with each other, having even spaces between them, as well as having them centered from top to bottom and side to side. I started by doing the center parts, then the outer parts from there, making sure to do it on both sides. And once I'm done that, I'm just going to follow the pattern throughout the rest of one side and then do the opposite side. And I'm not doing all of it on camera because it does get fairly repetitive. And I think when you see just a little bit, you kind of see where the pattern goes and how to create the pattern in order to duplicate it. Now I chose to do white on black cardstock. I think it would be fun to do colors as well. Definitely if you did colors, it wouldn't be quite as bold as the black on white. But like I said before, this isn't something that I would do often. This isn't something that I wouldn't do for someone that didn't necessarily appreciate it. I just thought it would create a really cool look. And it's also just a different, unique way to use these brackets that you may not have seen elsewhere. And for something like this, liquid glue is definitely your friend because it gives you that wiggle room and you have that flexibility to move it and adjust it to make sure that everything is nice and straight. Once I have my whole background done, there is no point in doing the thin brackets for these last tiny little bits because you're really only going to see the ends. So what I did was I took a thin bracket die cut and I just cut it up a little bit. These pieces are going to be so minor on the background that it doesn't need to be perfect. I'm just wanting to get little tiny bits there because you are going to see a few of those pieces or a little bit of that piece. You're not going to see a ton of it. So once that is totally glued down, I'm going to let that glue set completely before I trim my background. So when it is completely set, I'm taking my background and like I said before, I'm cutting 1/4 inch off of each side. This is going to make this piece, once it's completely trimmed, 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm taking one of the printed papers from that 6-inch printed paper pack and I'm trimming that to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And I chose one of the ones that had a floral background there because I wanted to see a lot of the colors. There are some that have polka dot prints on it. There are some that have diagonal lines or plaid. I wanted something that had a bunch of different colors that you'd be able to see around the outside of my die cut piece. But I didn't want anything geometrical that was going to conflict or whatnot with that die cut background. So I have a Just Saying sentiment here. I have a couple hearts. Those little heart die cuts were part of the inspiration for that second card where I did the ink blending. I thought those hearts were cute with the different colors on them. So I added that Just Saying on the back, then the hearts, and then a second sentiment that says "You the best," which I think works well with the Just Saying. Now, obviously, this background I think would look great with some floral die cuts on it as well, similar to the ones that I used in the first card. I chose not to do that because I wanted the die cuts that I used to be different for each card, but that's definitely an option, and I think those florals would work well on this background as well. So here is the final result. Again, I love the way that background looks. It's not one that I would repeat often because it's definitely a labor of love. And then we have our embossed background with the distress ink colors on it, and I love that bold black background with those distress inks. I love the combination of black with those colors. Then we have our hello heart that has the distressed and then splattered heart pieces. And then finally our heart with the embossed sections. And I really love the texture the embossing folder has given each one of those little sections there. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.